Hello YouTube, Dave here again. Welcome back to another installment in my recap series for my Crown of the Kobold King campaign for Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Today we're going to be recapping the events of sessions 2 and 3. The reason I'm going to include both of these instead of each one having its own individual video is simply because the third session was a little bit shorter in terms of overall progress for a couple of different reasons. One of which was the fact that partway through the characters all gained second level, and with only 2 copies of the core rulebook, one being the pocket edition, the other being the first printing of the hardcovers, it takes a while for everybody to get their second level options, since there's a lot of choices to be made for like class feats, skill feats, and some other options there as well, depending on the classes. So about half of the third session was dedicated just to getting everybody leveled up. And we also had to cut that session about an hour short for reasons that I will not be talking about today, but there will be an update for that definitely coming soon in just a few weeks' time. But it's good stuff. It's stuff that our family is really excited for. It's not really gaming related though, but like I said, when the time comes, I'll share everything with everybody. So in the second session, we began with the players returning to the lumber camp after defeating the Tatzelworm, which is what they finished the previous session on. Getting back there to the camp and resting overnight to recover from the damage they took from that particular fight. Our heroes were escorted out into the woods to find the location where one of the lumberjacks had gone missing. It's here where the loggers found the axe of the individual, along with a leg snare trap and wolf footprints. So this is why the rumors of a highly intelligent wolf had been sort of spreading around. Now, the lumberjacks, they didn't hang around. They immediately went back to the camp. But they're not necessarily like woodland survivalists. They're not rangers. They're not trained in woodland lore. They just go into the forest and then chop trees down with their axes. So when the players actually investigated the scene, they did discover that there was a set of wolf-like footprints there, and with the proper knowledge check, knowledge nature, the characters were able to discover that this was probably not a standard wolf, but the size of the prints and everything else was more in line with a warg, which is a more intelligent, more vicious version of a standard wolf. They also discovered that while there were lots of footprints in the area from human traffic, there were also 3 sets of prints that seemed human-like, but were different enough that, again, with the proper check, the characters were able to determine that these were likely hobgoblin or hobgoblin footprints that were also in the area. So they're currently working under the assumption that hobgoblin or hobgoblins might be setting the traps and taking whoever was caught in them to some direction. They didn't know exactly where, but they were able to follow the footprints. This is also the session number 2, where the player playing the hermit character, the hermit wizard, decided to switch his character from a wizard to a druid. For a couple of different reasons. Number one, the druid sort of fit the hermit theme that he had a little bit better. And second, the party also had a sorceress, so they did have arcane spellcasting capabilities already, but what they were lacking in was a lot of healing magic. The goblin alchemist was able to create some elixirs of life, but that was somewhat limited, and it depended on him actually mixing them as opposed to focusing more primarily on his alchemical bombs. So we decided to switch his character to the druid. We only had the 1 session in, and I had given other players the options to change their characters as well, especially the players that were using just the pre-gen characters. But since I had made that offer, then I allowed this other player to take advantage of it as well, because again, I want him to play something that he's going to have fun with. So our players, with our druid and our dwarven ranger sort of leading the way, they follow these hobgoblin footprints to a circular clearing, like a suspiciously perfectly circular clearing, the center of which rests a dilapidated little like cottage or cabin, which had obviously been the subject of some sort of attack. Like it seemed like it had been partially burned down. The ceiling had collapsed in several places. There were holes that had formed in the walls with soot and scorch marks all around it. The alchemist, recognizing this for the subject of his personal background, immediately, just without even thinking about it, just started taking off running towards this cabin, because his personal motivation for wanting to enter the woods here was that he was searching for the home of a hag that had been defeated and killed several years ago by a band of adventurers. This hag was known for brewing various concoctions and potions and alchemical items, and he was there hoping to find the secrets that she had to crafting some of these like really nefarious or notorious alchemical items that she had been known for. So he started taking off directly to the cabin while the other characters actually looked around. And it was here that they discovered that there were indeed 3 hobgoblins that were lying in ambush. The ambush didn't quite get off, however, and but the fight did break out. 2 of the hobgoblins were focusing on their longbows, and the other hobgoblin was one wearing a heavier armor, a shield, and a sword, and he seemed to be commanding the others. During the fight, our alchemist, who had run into the cabin before the battle began, just started lobbing alchemical items out through the various holes in the wall to varying degrees of success, because at one point he was trying to throw a smoke stick that he had crafted, and he wanted to throw it out so it would sort of obscure some of the other characters. They could use it as cover to advance on the hobgoblins. However, he did roll a natural 1 for that, and the cabin very quickly filled up with smoke. However, the players were able to defeat the hobgoblin archers before our dwarven ranger went into like a one-on-one combat against the hobgoblin with the armor, the heavy armor, the shield and sword, before he was very quickly taken down by just a series of pretty strong hits. With the rest of the player, however, he did take some damage in the process, and he did take off running into the woods with his companions already having been slain. He took off running. Our druid came over and stabilized our dwarven ranger before he and a few other characters took off running into the woods, leaving only the dwarven ranger and the goblin alchemist behind. While the hobgoblin did have a head start, he also was familiar with the terrain that he was going through, and he already had a pre-planned escape route. So the characters started following. They were able to pick up the trail, and they were chasing after the hobgoblin when they discovered that he had run into a section of the woods that was completely covered with gigantic and thick spider webs. And again, it was obvious by looking around that the hobgoblin had scouted this area previous and had a route that he could run through at top speed without triggering the spiders or letting them know. However, the player characters would have a harder time being able to follow that path at any degree of speed. While they were chasing after the hobgoblin, our goblin alchemist did find something that he was looking for. Inside of the hut was basically everything was tossed. Most things of value had already been taken. There were items that were starting to like rot and mold on the ground. However, underneath this cauldron in the center of the hut was a partially burned formula book that the hag had used in the past. The goblin, reaching for the formula book, was suddenly surprised by the fact that the cauldron was actually an animated object and began attacking immediately, with the only characters there to fight it off being the alchemist and our dwarven ranger. The pot did have a great degree of damage reduction or hardness, so it was difficult to deal physical damage. However, using his alchemical items, especially like flasks of acid and things like that, the goblin alchemist was able to destroy the cauldron and claim his prize. The other characters, believing that maybe it's a bad idea to run off into spider-infested woods, made their way back eventually, just as the Goblin Alchemist and the Dwarf Ranger had defeated this animated construct cauldron. With that out of the way, the characters sort of rest and try to recover from their wounds, and the alchemist was reading through what he had discovered, this partially destroyed book that had been thrown onto a fire but didn't fully incinerate. He was unfortunately not able to find a wealth of information. However, because this player was only going to be around for a short time, since he's visiting the province further west from Alberta, and he was going to be going back in just a few weeks, I allowed him to make a discovery from this formula book that would allow him to enhance one of his alchemical bombs. So the options that I'd given him, he had to choose one from the following list. So one was to increase the damage die one step. So something that was 1d4 would become 1d6. If it was a d6, it would become a d8. So that was one of the options. Another option was to add 1 to the splash damage that would be caused by the alchemical bomb. So instead of splash being a single point, it could now deal 2 points to everybody adjacent to the target that was struck by it. Another option was to increase the persistent damage by 1 for items that had persistent damage, or to give persistent 1 to an item that didn't necessarily already have it. And then the fourth and final option was that if he threw an alchemical bomb and scored a critical hit, the splash damage would instead become the equivalent to the standard damage for the alchemical bomb. So like, for example, if it was 1d6, instead of it being 1 point of splash damage to everybody adjacent to the individual struck, if he gets hit with a critical attack, everybody adjacent takes the 1d6 as well. However, this would prevent him from being able to shape the splash damage with his alchemist ability so that it can only hit the primary target. This would be something where it just scatters and hits absolutely everybody around. Again, this might be a little bit of an overpowered ability, perhaps, but he was only going to be here for 1 or 2 more sessions, and then the character would sort of end up leaving the group after that, because I don't like to run a lot of NPCs, especially when I already have a group of 5 other players, even with him gone. So, knowing that it would only be for a session or 2, I allowed him to make whatever choice that he wanted. And it was only going to affect 1 alchemical bomb, so it was essentially a way of preparing the reagents to create them and make them more powerful for that specific alchemical item, and it wouldn't transfer to any other ones, unless it was like a more powerful version of one that he had already taken with the abilities. He chose to enhance his flask of acid, which normally only did a single point of damage on a regular hit, and he asked if he could apply the increase in the damage die to that. And I said, absolutely go for it. Now, typically, if you go from 1 to a die, it's normally a d3, but I just let him roll a d4. It's a maximum of 1 extra point. And again, he was only going to be around for a couple more sessions, so I wasn't too particularly worried about that. So the players having rested, our alchemist having enhanced his acid flasks, they now set out following the original set of hobgoblin tracks that they had been following, and not the individual hobgoblin that had run off on a pre-scouted escape route. Eventually, they found these abandoned ruins near the foot of the volcano, one of the Droskar's volcano there, and they recognized this as Droskar's crucible. This was sort of like the above-ground monastery that had been established over top of the dwarven stronghold that was to be found underneath. Now, for a lot of the other characters, their backgrounds were tied to finding the crucible, either directly or indirectly through what they're trying to do. It was discovered that the larger wolf tracks were going in this direction as well, and the hobgoblins, which did strengthen the idea that the hobgoblins were working with this warg for some reason or another. The ruins themselves were not abandoned, as a pack of wolves, I think it was 3 or 4 wolves, were sort of patrolling the area leading up to the gate to enter the monastery itself. Now, our druid, brimming with confidence with his newfound druidic abilities, including wild empathy, decided that he was going to go up and try to negotiate with the wolves to allow the party to pass safely, which was a plan that absolutely could have worked with his wild empathy ability However, it was based off of rolling diplomacy, or persuasion, of which he had +0. And he did roll pretty good, but unfortunately, a 13 is not enough to adjust the attitude, and the attitude would go from hostile to indifferent at best in this situation. And since he had walked out into the middle of these wolves and the other players had decided that they were going to hang back, the wolves just descended upon him, and in very quick order, the druid was knocked into unconsciousness. The other party members did respond, however, and began attacking the wolves, trying to get them away from the druid. However, one of the wolves stayed with the druid and began dragging him towards the ruins, likely to devour a little bit later. However, the players were able to take out the wolves after a little bit of trouble. I think the dwarf ranger was once again had taken quite a bit of damage in the process. However, he did survive and he was not knocked unconscious, bringing the druid back up into consciousness, allowing him to regain a few hit points and sort of steady himself against what had just happened. The players then decide that they were going to check out the guard tower that was off in the this particular corner here. They did do a series of listen checks on the outside of the door. However, they all rolled relatively poorly, or just not enough in this case. And the dwarf ranger opened up the door, stepped inside, and was ambushed by a trio of hunting spiders, one of which was actually able to successfully poison the ranger, knocking him down to just a couple of hit points at this point before he was able to shrug off the damage. Thinking quickly, the player characters did slam the door shut, and there was no way for the spiders to get out. There were like little, almost like arrow slits in the guard tower, but there weren't any windows that would be large enough for them to crawl out of. It does seem as if whoever's here had trapped these spiders in there with the hopes of being able to domesticate them. In the brief period of time that the door was open, however, the players did notice that there was an awful lot of wooden structures inside of that tower, including support beams, crates and barrels, as well as a set of wooden stairs that was leading up to the top of the guard tower. And deciding that they didn't really want to battle the spiders, directly, concocted a plan where one of the players opened up the door really quickly while the alchemist threw in some alchemist fire to catch the dry wooden objects on fire, and then they slammed the door. They could hear the sounds of the spiders sort of bursting as they were burned to death, with thick plume of smoke emerging from the guard tower. And this is effectively where we ended the second session. So the players had definitely made their appearance known, if not through the fight with the wolves, definitely by creating a huge smoke signal for anybody that was in the ruins to be able to recognize. So at the beginning of session 3, the players were still reeling from the battle with the wolves, as well as the dwarf being ambushed by those spiders, and they decided that they needed to back off and try to find a way to rest and try to recover from some of the damage they had taken, to regain spells, to regain alchemical items and things of that nature. So they may find their way to sort of a safe location. They went back to the hag's hut and rested there overnight before going back to Droskar's crucible in the morning. When they arrived back in the morning, they did find that a group of kobolds had now been sort of patrolling or were on guard at the entrance, the gate entrance, the shattered gate, the destroyed smash gate entrance to the ruins themselves. So it was a trio of kobolds with crossbows, hand crossbows, as well as a pair of wolves. However, the players did make relatively quick work out of the kobolds and the wolves before they decided to enter the ruins themselves. Now, they had actually initially planned on going through the front door there. However, they decided that maybe instead they would patrol and look around the outside of the structure first to see if there were any ways of progressing inside. They did find that this area here, which is an old library that is filled with mildew and mold, actually had a collapsed section of wall there that was also at a bit of a flooded area that they were able to sort of make their way in through. Taking a look at the bookshelves and using detect magic, they did find that there were a couple of magical scrolls that were on one of the bookshelves there. However, they didn't want to actually touch the books too directly. They were taking their time trying to clear some of the mold out of the way, I believe using a mage hand. Or no, I think it was prestidigitation actually, that they were using to clear the area. However, them disrupting things, regardless of what steps they were trying to take, did awaken a swarm of spiders that emerged from the bookshelf and began attacking the sorceress. Now, this is one of those moments where, you know, the group, you expect them to engage in some act of daring heroics and come together to fight off this just writhing swarm of gross, disgusting spiders. However, everybody basically abandoned the sorceress. The dwarf ranger was one of the first characters to go, and realizing that he's not going to be super effective against a swarm, decided that he was just going to leave out through this door and go down the hallway there to see if he could hear anything going on in that direction. After that, the alchemist, who did have abilities that would be very useful against the spider swarm, decided to follow the dwarf. And then moments later, our elven rogue decided that since he also didn't really have anything that was great at combating a swarm of spiders, since he just had his like short swords and stuff like that, he also ended up leaving the room with the sorceress there by herself, getting absolutely bodied by this swarm of spiders. The sorceress was able to defeat the swarm on her own, however, and I think I might give him a few extra experience points because of the fact that he sort of had to deal with that on his own. However, while that was going on, the other characters that had left did come across this chapel area where a group of kobolds actually began arguing with one another about who should go deal with the shrieking noise that came from the library, with everybody trying to pretend that they were in charge, before the players ended up opening the door, charging in, and dispatching of the kobolds. And that was the end of the third session. So again, it was a bit of a shorter one, because of the fact that they did end up gaining a level after dealing with the guards that were stationed out front here, so that did take a little bit of time. But they are now fully rooted in the Droskar's crucible, the above ground ruins, and I'm fairly confident that they will finish this upper level pretty decently quickly, going into session number 4, which is going to be taking place early in September. We're now at our once a month sessions as opposed to once a week that we were doing while our friend was visiting from out of province. But he is now on his way back to Alberta, and once a week is just going to be a little bit too much for me to do, especially with the other games that I've been running. But yeah, it's been really fun running this so far. And for me, the highlights absolutely had to be the failed attempt at wolf-based diplomacy, the spider ambush, and basically just setting a tower on fire rather than having to deal with them. And the fact, again, that the other players just didn't want to deal with spiders at all, leaving the sorceress, the character with the fewest hit points, in the party to deal with a swarm that doesn't even need to make attack rolls in order to damage you. So yeah, it was definitely a fun time so far, and I'm glad that the alchemist player was able to achieve his character's personal motivation before he ended up going back. And yeah, it's just been a ton of fun so far. Now, if you have the Crown of the Kobold King book and you're looking at some of these encounters, I have made some modifications, I have made some changes, including adding combatants to some of the fights. For example, like the Hobgoblin encounter was meant to be just a single solitary Hobgoblin, but having a group of 5 to 6 players, it just would have been an absolute massacre. And the same thing went with like the Kobold zombie that was encountered in the first session. It was meant to just be a single zombie, but at that point I did have all 6 players present, so I really felt like I needed to modify things. And I'm not saying that it's necessarily a bad thing that there's a lot of single encounters or single creature encounters early on in this particular adventure, but it was designed for a group of 4 characters as opposed to a group of 5 or 6. And I just wanted to have the combatants stick around long enough that everybody gets to do something in combat, right? So, but with that in mind, I don't mind modifying pre-written encounters or adventures. I've been doing it for years now, and it's been a really great experience. I also did swap out the swarm. It was supposed to be a swarm of bats. I didn't have miniatures for a swarm of bats, but I did have a swarm of spiders, so that's what I ended up going with. And considering the way that they reacted to the spiders, not only in the woods and trying to avoid them at all costs, but also just setting the ones on fire. Oh, I should also mention before I forget, during session 2, after defeating the hobgoblins and while they were initially resting up after that at the Hag's Hut, several of the characters had up a watch rotation, including our dwarf ranger, who took watch really, really well, in that he flat out declared that once he's on watch, he falls asleep and wakes up just early enough to wake up the next person in the rotation. I did roll to see if anything would happen during that period, and it was during that time that the hobgoblin bodies that had just been left near the edge of the clearing, those were taken away by the spiders, essentially acting as scavengers. But I thought it was a lot of fun. Especially the way that the dwarf has been played so far, with his willingness to just immediately engage in a bar brawl and his dependency on watch. Just fantastic stuff. I'm loving it, and I can't wait for the next session. Anyway, that was my recap of sessions 2 and 3 of my Crown of the Kobold King campaign. In a few weeks' time, I will have the recap for session number 4, and I can't wait to see what happens there. Now, let me know in the comments below if any of you have gone through this adventure. What were your experiences getting to Droskar's Crucible? Did you have any issues with like spiders in the guard tower, or with kobolds in the chapel? Did they find the Hag's Hut? What were some of the characters' motivations for doing the exploration? Let me know all that below. So thank you once again for watching. I appreciate it, and I will see you all next time. Until then, take care.